What's going on, everybody? My name is Greg Peters. You are watching the CarPassion channel, and today I'll be answering one of my most frequently asked questions: does it rub? And the short answer is yes. Wait. There is way more to wheel and tire fitment than just a simple yes or no answer to that question. See, when I get bombarded over all my social medias with the same question over and over, it's a great indicator that I really need to make a video on a topic. And with Donut Media just releasing their wheel and tire selection video for Miatas a couple days ago, I figured this would be the perfect time. So I'm currently rocking a 1992 Miata with 15x10 wheels and 245 wide tires on all four corners. And I have that package stuffed under stock fenders. So what I want to teach you today are some of the tips and tricks that I've learned over the last decade of pushing the limits of functional tire fitment. Seriously, by the end of this video, you're going to be able to take your next wheel setup to new heights. And this isn't just for Miatas either. What I'm going to show you right now can be used on any kind of car to get more aggressive and more functional tire fitment. So let's jump over to the Miata. Alright, I want to start at the rear of the car by taking a detailed look at some of the work done to the fender and the wheel well area. Now, a lot of people ask, how do I know how much to roll my fenders when I'm buying a new set of wheels and tires? And I always recommend buying your set of wheels and tires first and then putting them on the car. That will let you mold the fenders to fit perfectly to your wheel and tire setup. I see a lot of people over rolling their fenders and then they get like a big overhang off the tire. But how do you know what size wheels and tires and offset and all of that you want for your Miata? Well, a good place to start is Fitment threads. I'll link a couple of those down below, but you usually see like 20-30 pages of people just posting pictures of their cars with the tire and wheel sizes and offsets and all that stuff. I'll also link my fender rolling video down below. It's kind of old, but the information is still good. Now, before we take a look inside this fender, gotta get the wheel off. The first thing I want to talk about here is called a lip roll. And no, I'm not talking about beatboxing. I'm talking about this lip right here. You can see it goes maybe about ½ an inch or so. And most factory cars have a lip like this that goes all the way over the fender, and it's the first thing an aggressive tire setup is going to hit. So the first thing you want to do is roll that lip completely flat. And that lip is flat all the way until it meets the rear bumper tab. One hack that you always want to remember before you start doing a lip roll is to make an incision right there, because it'll allow you to roll the lip flat all the way to the bumper tab. A lot of times also you will have to cut that bumper tab to clear. On my setup, I did not have to do that, but I definitely needed the flat lip roll all the way down. The next thing you need to do to get even more tire clearance is pull the fenders. A fender pull is where you have the roller pretty close to vertical or matching the angle of the fender, and you're trying to pull the metal outwards like this. Now I'll take you over to this side to show you what a flare is, because this side I actually did a little bit better. So to flare the edge of the fender, you're actually going to start changing the angle of the roller outwards. If you look closely at a stock Miata fender, they actually go almost vertical downwards at this lip right here. What I have here is almost the complete opposite. It's completely flared out, and it helps get that last little bit of clearance right here. And you always want to finish your pull before you start to flare that last little bit, because once you flare the edge of the fender, it's hard to get the roller at the correct angle to pull it out farther. And you'll kind of realize when you're at the limit of pulling the fender, once you're cranking on that fender roller and it's just not moving any further. Then you'll know it's time to start to angle out the roller and work on this last little bit of flare. And I mean, my flare goes all the way to here, probably starts about here. And the last thing I had to do in the rear specifically for the 15x10s was tie up the rear brake line. Just had to be lowered a tiny bit, not to rub the barrel of the wheel, and obviously that could turn into a pretty serious problem if you don't catch it. Now for the most important trick you're gonna need, let me pull this coilover out. You also need to disconnect your rear sway bar for this. Just one link, one side. And if your car is on jack stands on one side, you might need to jack up the control arm to unload the sway bar to get it unbolted. And I will forewarn you, if you have coilovers, this step is going to be a lot easier for you. One trick is to actually lower the coilover more so it's shorter and it comes out easier. Now that that's all done, I'm going to reinstall the wheel. 2 lug nuts is fine. We're definitely not going to be driving the car with no coilover. Now, put your floor jack underneath the rear control arm. You can simulate full, like real world wheel travel and see if there are going to be any problem areas. And I basically use this method starting with completely stock fenders just to see what areas are going to need the most work. So now you can see with the suspension all the way bottomed out, I have full clearance from front to back. And normally a test you can do is to spin the tire. If you have an open diff or a torsion, you will be able to do that with your other wheel on the ground. I have an upgraded clutch type limited slip, so I cannot spin the tire, but you know, I can spin it a tiny bit back and forth and see that it's not rubbing. And then with this test, you'll know if I jack the control arm all the way up and I have contact issues right in here, you can clearly see, oh, I just need to grind that tab away a little bit, or I just need to roll this lip a tiny bit more and I'll get full clearance. Let me tell you about a part of the Miata's suspension design that's actually not advantageous for fitting more aggressive setups. The Miata has 2 control arms, an upper and a lower, and in order to adjust the camber in factory form, it uses the lower control arm. So to add negative camber, the lower arm is pushed out, so the bottom of the wheel is pushed out. And that will help this clearance a little bit, just in that it affects the angle of attack in which the tire is coming into the fender. But imagine how helpful it would be if the upper arm was used to adjust camber. If you had a tiny little clearance issue right here, and you shorten that upper arm to add negative camber, it's just gonna pull this tire right off the fender and you'll clear by miles. Now, since I've got the Paco Motorsports adjustable upper control arms, I can show you exactly how this camber setting will affect your fitment. And I actually need to play with this a little bit because I'm gonna minimize my negative camber to try to gain a little extra straight line traction. With the current amount of camber, you can see we do have a little bit of clearance between the tire and the fender. I'm not sure if you'll be able to tell from that back-to-back footage, but that is really tight fitment now. I mean, that's so tight, the little nipples on the tire are actually rubbing on the fender. So that's about maxed out for the minimum amount of negative camber that I can have, which should help with straight line traction a little bit. Okay, there's one more thing to address in the rear. Normally, if you're just going to a wider wheel and tire, in order to get it to fit, you just have to increase the positive offset, which takes the entire setup and moves it inboard towards the car. So you get a wider setup, but you push it in so it clears that fender better. But there's a limit to that because the inside barrel just keeps moving in farther and farther and farther until eventually you hit something. So we have to check the rear for full clearance throughout the travel to make sure that the tire and the wheel is not going to hit the control arm, the coilover bucket, anything like that. So on the Miata in the rear, fortunately we have like a mile of control arm clearance. The closest thing you really get to is that, you know, bucket that the coilover sits inside of to the tire. That's less than an inch, but honestly, I think I could fit 11s on this car. But the challenge with that is I want to run the same wheel size in the front as I do in the rear, and I would not want to try to push the front to 11s. Oh yeah, and then the last thing, which I showed you earlier, when that brake line is not tied up, it does rub the barrel of the wheel. You can see it is pretty close right there. So just something to be conscious of. All right, now let's talk about the front fitment. In the front, you're gonna face mostly the same challenges that you face in the rear, with one major curveball thrown in, and that is that the front tires, as you all know, steer the car. So now you have a big tire, and you have to make it clear everything at all steering angles, under all suspension loads and travel points, and that's where it gets pretty challenging. So let me go ahead and get this wheel off, and I'll show you some of the fender work that's done in the front. Go ahead and disconnect your front sway bar and remove the front coilover, just like the rear. The first thing some of you will probably notice is I do not have front fender liners. I don't drive the car in the rain very often, so I removed those because they do cause a clearance issue. And the biggest issue they cause is because they use these little tabs to bolt to the fenders. Now this one is still intact, but the upper ones, the very first thing I do for front fitment is cut those tabs off. Then you can do a flat lip roll. You can see the front fender, it has the same type of lip that the rear does, and that usually goes all the way around. This is completely flat rolled. The fender is pulled out, and it's even got a decent amount of flare on it. Another super common issue is right where the bumper meets the fender. There's a little tab. It's usually bolted down right there, and I have that sectioned out because I had an issue with the tire rubbing it. Obviously, when you take the bolt out, the bumper is not secured to the fender. That's the main reason that I have this quick release bumper kit here. The band usually just helps hold that in place. Now, they break every couple months sitting in the sun, so that's why there's not one on there right now. Another option is to drill a hole farther back. You can see there is another hole back there that you could use to secure the fender to the bumper. Another thing you'll need to do is take this harness and zip tie it up much higher. You can see at one point I did have a rubbing issue. Fortunately, it did not go all the way through the wiring, and I realized that I have to tie that harness up much higher so when the suspension goes through its travel, it's not rubbing up against that. Just at full lock, the brake line will contact the barrel of the wheel, so I just have a piece of header wrap secured around the brake line, so when it does contact a little bit, it's not really that big of a deal. I just keep an eye on that thing, make sure it's still there. This is kind of gonna, you know, have a big effect on what you use your car for. If you're using it for grip, if you're using it for drifting, that's all gonna come into play when you're choosing your wheel and tire setup, but I'll get more into that detail when I put the wheel on. Look at that. So as you can see, with the car rolling straight down the highway, you're hitting bumps, whatever, you got tons of clearance. I mean, that's a big gap right there, so we're fine there. But problem arises when you start steering. And so we've actually got clearance still somehow through the lock up at the top of the fender. But when we get more suspension compression, that's when the problem begins. So yes, that is where the front tires rub. But let's think about a couple things here. First of all, let me show you the position of the steering wheel. It does get pretty far around before the contact begins. If you're driving aggressively, you really don't get too much past this unless you're in a hairpin. But this is also where having a little bit of a lip flare on the edge of the front fender is gonna help, because even though this tire is rubbing, it's not really doing any damage. Okay, it's gonna take a little bit of the paint off. You might even get a little bit of chipping like this at the front. You're gonna have to make a little bit of a sacrifice. Now you can see my paint is still really good all around the fender, except for that little tiny chip. But from the outside, you can't really see much of anything. The other thing to consider, look at the direction the wheel is pointed, right? It's pointed to the right. Now, if the car is turning right, this suspension is gonna be lifted high. It's probably gonna be here, or maybe even higher, depending on how hard the turn is. Where you really need this tire to clear under full compression is turning the opposite direction. When I'm turning left, this suspension is the one that's gonna compress severely. So you can see it is getting a little risky there. I could use a little bit more flare on the fender just in this area, but the front suspension is fully compressed and the tire is just barely rubbing. Another important part to having this flared out at an angle, it's gonna help this tire not catch the fender. And then all through here, all up in front, we got clearance everywhere. Another area people have trouble with is behind the front tire. You can see where I folded that fender liner tab back. I had to do that for clearance, and it is tight, but it clears. One way you can get this to clear even more is you can fold this lip back just like you're doing a lip roll like you do on the top of the fender, but you can also adjust your front caster, which moves the wheel forward and backwards in the wheel well. Now, obviously, that is changing the handling of the car. But I'm gonna be real honest with you guys. My Miata is completely a street car. If it takes a couple tenths of a degree of caster or camber to get the wheels to fit right so I can run a baller 15x10 setup, that is good enough for me. I'm not out there chasing tenths on the racetrack, nor am I chasing tenths of a degree of camber for a perfectly optimized alignment. This is totally a street car. It's totally built for fun. Now, it's got over 400 horsepower and it's got big sticky tires on it, so naturally it is gonna be pretty fast. I don't really care about making, you know, a small sacrifice and having the perfect alignment. If you're building a purely track Miata, I'd probably not recommend trying this. I mean, you could also go to a little more extreme measures to get the front fitment to work better under full compression. You can actually space out the fender on the back to give you more clearance, or you can make a cut to widen this arch even more. But honestly, I'm just all about the street cred. I'm all about the fun. This car is just really fun. And I get a lot of people asking me about the fitment of the wheels and how to put 15x10s on a Miata with 245s. So hopefully this video has been helpful so far. Now, we talked about steering direction versus suspension compression already in a grip scenario. But in a drifting scenario, that's obviously opposite. If you flick the car, you might be steering to the right, but the car is going left. Which means now your wheel is turned this direction and it's compressing, and you're gonna have some pretty hard contact on this fender right here. So if this was set up for drifting, you'd have to have, you know, either a much more aggressive fender roll or a less aggressive wheel setup. Maybe just go to a 15x9 with a 225, a little bit more positive offset. It's gonna sink it into the chassis a little bit more, and you'll get way better clearance on your fender. Now, as you can see, at its closest point, I am real close to that fender, but as long as it clears, we're good. You can see there's plenty of material that you can take off of both the fender and the bumper to get an extra 1/4 inch of clearance, no problem. Okay, now this is the part where you're asking, why don't you just go with a higher offset wheel and you'll gain some clearance between the tire and the fender? Well, at full lock, if we come in here and take a closer inspection, the inner barrel of the wheel does contact the upper control arm. That's at absolute full lock, which I never use. I don't use it to make U-turns, and again, this is not a drift car. So this setup would not work if you were drifting this car, or especially if you had angle spacers on the steering rack allowing you to steer even more angle. That would be an issue. The upper control arms would either have to be notched slightly, or you'd have to go with a more aggressive offset, which in that case you'd have more fender clearance issues. So it's absolutely true that this wheel setup is not perfect for everything, and it's not feasible for every type of driving. But that's exactly why I wanted to make this video. I wanted to go with this setup because I really like pushing the limits of functional fitment, and there aren't that many people running 15x10s with 245s. Now, I consider this functional for what I use the car for. Autocross, canyon runs, any sort of grip type event, this tire setup is fully functional for. In any sort of grip event, this is the maximum steering angle that this car will ever see. This is with the steering wheel at 180 degrees. Now, let me show you one more little thing. Let's go to the other side of the car, the bad side. I told you can't do 245s on a Miata. You'll frick your fenders right up. Okay, yes, my fender is pretty messed up right there. Look at it from the bottom too. Woo, bacon boys. So this is what happens when you have aggressive wheel fitment and you reverse through a dip or out of a driveway with your wheels turned in the wrong direction. Now remember, we've only covered forward rolling scenarios. Something changes when you reverse. So if you've got a pretty aggressive steering angle, I can roll this tire forward, no problem. But if I try to move this tire backwards, I cannot do it. And if I was actually driving the car and reversing, this tire would take this fender and it would turn it from an outie to an innie, which is exactly what happened on the fender on the driver's side, because backing out of my driveway, that's the side that compresses, and I pulled the fender in. And fun fact, I didn't even do it on the 245s, I did it when I was on 225s. So when you do have an aggressive tire setup, you have to be very mindful of when you are reversing, turning the wheels, and going through any sort of dip or something that can compress your suspension, because you will pull the fender in. And that's something that running a little bit of tire stretch actually does help with, because the sidewall is at a little bit more of an angle. It helps the tire kind of flow off the fender, so if there is contact, it doesn't do any damage. If you have a more square setup, it is prone to damaging the fender a little bit more, and it is a little bit harder to fit. So now, if any of your friends tell you,
my car rubs, I'm just gonna raise it so it doesn't rub anymore,
please link them to this video, get them fitted properly. Okay, right now I want you to drop in the comments below what wheel and tire setup are you running, or what wheel and tire setup do you want to run, especially now that you're equipped with this knowledge of being able to put basically whatever you want on your Miata. And speaking of comments, I'm friends with many of you on Facebook, but I have a problem. I'm getting to my friends limit on Facebook, so I'm not going to be able to accept any more friend requests pretty soon. So if you are on Facebook and you want to follow me, I do post some extra stuff on there. I'm also going to be posting all my CarPassion videos on there. So if you'd rather watch them on Facebook versus YouTube, you can follow me there. The page is just the CarPassion channel. And if you like that page, it does help me out. It does help the channel out. I will see you guys there. Did you find this video helpful? Don't forget to slap a like on it. Subscribe if you are new, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.